Hello and welcome. I'm Fr Jim Mulroney and I'm your host for this edition of Meet a Columban. Our guest today is Fr Warren Kinne. From Queensland, Warren was ordained in 1970 in his hometown of Bundaberg, so this year is celebrating the Golden Jubilee of his ordination. During his 50 years as a priest, he's had a wide variety of commitments, beginning in the Philippines during the turbulent and conflicted years of martial law in the 1970s. This was followed by a study in Rome and a lengthy period teaching in the Columban Seminary in Sydney. He is in many ways the father of the Columban Lay Missionary Program, and most recently spent 20 years in China, during which the fruit of his diverse experiences morphed in creating a highly imaginative ministry that touched many aspects of life. He's now living in Queensland's Gold Coast. So welcome, Warren, and congratulations on your Golden Jubilee. And maybe a good place to start is at the end. In China, you were involved in teaching, as well as being instrumental in the founding and development of a rather different type of ministry among a disadvantaged group of workers that involved a wide range of people. So could you begin by telling us something about that endeavour?
Well, when I went to China, I wasn't really sure what I was going to be able to do or how to become, embedded in that country. I did language study for a few years, and then I went to Shanghai because we had some contacts there from my lay missionary times. Eventually, I got a position in Fudan University because I had a secular PhD from the United Kingdom, and I taught in the philosophy department, undergraduate students, originally then masters and PhD students. A lot of it was just trying to get those people to think for themselves and to have an appreciation of the Western philosophical tradition. I particularly like to teach things to do with the religious underpinnings of Western civilization. So it was the art of the possible for me. I wasn't there as one able to teach religion per se, but they gave me quite an amount of freedom to do things as I saw fit. So I sort of concocted my own courses that suited my own ends and also fulfilled the ends of the university. I also worked with the local church. There are a lot of expats in Shanghai, and eventually I was able to have regular masses on the weekends for those expat communities, which are quite large. And then the third thing that I was doing was with a group of friends, we noticed many internal migrant workers in Shanghai. In fact, nearly half the population was from outside of the city. And so we eventually set up an NGO that was originally registered in Hong Kong. It's now registered on the mainland. And it tried to help basically the children of migrant workers to get an education because they weren't eligible for the Shanghai school system.
How did you go about that work, or beginning to make contact with schools or the type of education institutes they were able to attend?
Well, we mucked around for a long time. I mean, it started with a meal with just some friends, and it took a while to convince others that there was a problem. And so one of the members was a lawyer, and she looked into legal aspects of migration. And eventually, also another one in the group was in charge of a factory that was out where there were a lot of migrant workers, and there was a school in that area. No windows or anything, no books, teachers that weren't fully qualified. So we eventually got in that way. It sort of started slowly, and then it built up momentum as time went by. But we also ran into our problems with local officials for the education department because they didn't like the idea of foreigners meddling in what's a very sensitive area. But by and large, we gave scholarships for kids so that they could go to school, buy books, get uniforms, and we helped show how teaching could be done better. We had outings for the children, and we also got some multinationals involved who would fund different programs and projects. So it was a multifaceted charity, but it started small and it never got real big, but it's still continuing.
Now, this is a group made up entirely pretty much of lay people, and the bulk of them, I think, were Catholic. Is that right?
It is true that without the Catholics, we probably wouldn't have been able to fundraise, and they also sort of trusted the organisation. But really, it was not a religious organisation. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to get off the ground. So it's always been my students from the university were involved early on, and they would come out and teach Saturday morning classes at some of these migrant schools in the countryside. And those students were not Catholic. They were just Chinese students with whatever background they had. So we always played down any religious affiliation. And it was registered as an NGO without religious affiliation.
Now, you were the pastor, I suppose, to this community of expatriates. They were quite dedicated to you. They really appreciated the ministry that you provided for them. And in a way, do you think that inspired many of these people to join a social movement like the ministry to the migrant workers or the children of the migrant workers?
I'm sure that that was the case for many, and I'm sure that it helped us a lot, particularly with fundraising. But again, it was not a Catholic organisation. And the present chairman, I mean, I was the original chairman, he is Anglican. And then a lot of the people that we had as executive secretaries, they were not Catholic either. So really, religion did help behind the scenes. We had a lot of people who were committed to the idea of a charity and understood what an NGO was about. But really it was, and we did try and do things with the church early on. And the church did give us some old property to operate in where we held different events. But again, we were always at pains to stress that it was a non-religious body.
Now, you seem to have quite an ability to inspire people to volunteer and to throw their lot in behind others. During your time, you also worked in the founding of the Columban Lay Mission Program, and that was very much a ministry involved with inspiring lay people to volunteer, to place their lives at the service of others. Did you find any likeness between your ministry in Shanghai and the long and arduous work you did in setting up the Columban Lay Mission Program?
Yes, well, I guess the Columban Lay Mission stint was before I went to China. In 1989, I was originally asked to be the first Central Lay Missionary Coordinator, and my office was in Ireland. And so it was 1990, which is just 30 years ago now. And that lay missionary body is celebrating its 30th anniversary. So I was there from the beginning of a structured program. And I think as missionaries, we see the interconnection of all things. We're crossing boundaries of language, culture, and trying to do new things, trying to bring lay people on board to work in partnership with others, male, female, married, single, lay, clergy. So that's always been a part of my vision, even since I worked on an attempt at a new constitution for the society in the late 70s. That was a vision that I always had. And I think it's come of age now, but it certainly had its difficulties along the way.
Now, the people that you worked with in Shanghai were in many ways people deprived of their natural rights. In the Philippines, you were in Mindanao, in the southern Philippines during the martial law period, the 1970s. It was a period of conflict, and it was a period when people very much were being deprived of their natural rights to live and to farm and earn their living. And they were also attacked violently. Is there likeness in the manner in which you set about working in that situation and in other situations of oppression that you've met during your life?
Well, I suppose I was a greenhorn when I went to the Philippines. I mean, that was 1971.
Come on, Warren, you were never a
May.
greenhorn.
And well, it was sort of totally unexpected. We were, in a sense, not prepared for it. I was in Mindanao for language study. Well, it was still May 1971. And then by the end of 71, I was in the parish of Dumalinaw. Now, the following year in 72, the 23rd of September, martial law was declared. And not long after that, the city was attacked by some sort of rebel group. People evacuated from Dumalinaw. They went back to areas of the Philippines where they'd come from originally. And the school emptied out, the principal disappeared, my cook left the convento, and sort of all of a sudden there was nothing happening. And so I was able to go with a group of a few catechists and another layman, and we just traveled around the villages. It had quite an extensive hinterland, this parish. And so for the next couple of years, we set up basic Christian communities and helped facilitate the emergence of lay leadership and gave them ongoing training. And I mean, it was also the context in Mindanao Sulu at that time that many things were happening that were quite original, really, within the church in the Philippines.
Could you explain a little bit more about the basic Christian community? What exactly is it, and how do you go about beginning to form one?
Well, the root problem, I guess, that forced us down that path or to think that way was the fact that you could only get to some of these places about once a year. There was something like 70 villages within this parish, and some of them were quite remote. You'd have to walk for hours to get to them. So it was obvious that if there was to be a church that was witnessing, worshipping, serving, self-governing, self-nourishing, self-sustaining, that it would have to look after itself and be lay-led. So that certainly became obvious once we started to move around to different places. So we'd say, really, you need leaders here that are a part of your community if you are to survive as church. Now, often they would appoint the wrong people as leaders first up, but they learn through inadequate leadership. And as time went by, very good leadership emerged in these communities, and they were very self-governing and self-sustaining.
And you wrote a book about this experience called The Splintered Staff, I think. Was that correct?
Yes, well, actually, it was my PhD thesis. At the time when I left Turramurra, after being on the staff there, I was looking for a way to bridge back into the Philippines. And so I went to the UK and tried to write up my experience of the Mindanao Sulu Church through the various Mindanao Sulu pastoral conferences. And of course, there was also the split between the bishops and the secretariat of this conference, which was very disappointing for me. I was in Australia at the time. It was in about 1983. So I wanted to understand better this period before I went back to the Philippines. So I just tried to research it, both from my own experience to reflect on it, but also the documentation that was around. And I interviewed many of the key bishops and former executive secretaries of the Mindanao Sulu Pastoral Conference. And so that was my thesis. It was later printed as a book in the Philippines by Flourishing Press.
Now, there's a lot of talk in Australia at present about the need for lay leadership in our parishes and in our church. some of it's predicated by what they call the shortage of priests. But do you see any possibility of using that same dynamic that you saw operate in the Philippines, operating effectively in Australia?
Well, I think it needs to happen because priests are getting older and fewer on the ground. The church is needing to invite many from overseas, and they're a big help to the church. But in the end, the Australian church was a fairly self-sufficient church, say in the 70s, and now it isn't. So it makes it very obvious that lay people need to be more involved. And the clericalism that the Pope speaks about in the church is often a hindrance to the emergence of the charisms that exist within the community. I can see here on the Gold Coast, for example, where there's very rapid growth in population in places like Coomera, north of here, which is really linking up with Brisbane as one mega city. It will be eventually. Well, there's just no people, no clergy or parish presence in vast swaths of this suburbia. So lay people need to be involved. There needs to be small house churches or small communities that can come together on a regular basis and that are not priest-centered. It just seems so obvious to me.
Among the contacts that you have at present, Warren, do you see those type of people emerging from among the laity?
Well, there are always people like that around. I meet with a very interesting group of young adults on a Friday night, which is really a remnant of my time in Griffith University. And there's wonderful leadership there, very intelligent people, well educated. Most of them come from overseas, Latin America, Africa, Asia. Not too many of our traditional, what would you say, Anglo-Saxon, Irish, Catholic that you and I would have grown up with here. They don't seem to be around by and large, but there are many migrants that are very interested in church. But I'm sure that once something new is initiated, that people will get on board. They're there, but it takes a mindset change with the clergy. Often they just downsize to fit the possibilities that they have of running things. But really, in the end, what you finish up with is just a church that is much smaller than it should be.
Okay, Warren, we might leave it there. Thank you very much. And I think anybody watching can see that we're both pretty old, and we're a good manifestation of part of this situation that the Australian Church is facing. But congratulations once again on your Golden Jubilee, and thank you very much for giving us this time today.
Thanks, Jim. Blessings.
Thank you.